When Natalie called the plumber, she wasn't thinking about anything but the leaking kitchen sink. Her husband, Rob, had been distant for months, buried in work, coming home late, avoiding conversation. They hadn't had a meaningful connection in almost a year, and she had grown used to silence. The plumber, Tony, arrived on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. He was friendly, confident, and talked just enough to make her feel seen. While he worked, they chatted, first about the leak, then about life. He asked if she was okay. No one had asked her that in a long time. The conversation deepened unexpectedly. Natalie confessed she often felt invisible in her own home. Tony listened, really listened, and somehow in that quiet kitchen something shifted. She didn't touch him, he didn't cross a line, but they shared something far more dangerous than that, an emotional connection. Over the following weeks, Tony returned under the guise of checking on the fix. Each time, their conversations grew longer, warmer. She found herself laughing again. She began to dress up on the days he'd come by. The spark terrified her, but also revived her. One afternoon, Rob came home early and saw her sitting with Tony at the kitchen table, her hand briefly brushing his as she laughed. The silence that followed said everything. Tony left awkward and regretful. Rob didn't yell. He simply asked, "Is he giving you what I haven't?" And Natalie realized then that the emotional affair had cut deeper than any physical betrayal could have. It wasn't about sex. It was about feeling alive, about being valued. They entered couples therapy. It wasn't easy. Rob had to hear hard truths. Natalie had to admit her part in letting the emotional distance grow. But the confrontation, painful as it was, forced them to face the truth they'd both ignored. Infidelity is often narrowly understood as a purely physical act, something that happens in secret bedrooms, involving lust and betrayal in its most obvious form. However, in many real-life cases, especially in long-term relationships or marriages, the deeper and more insidious type of infidelity begins not with touch but with neglect. Emotional infidelity is a growing concern in modern relationships, and it typically starts when one partner begins to feel unseen, unheard, and emotionally disconnected from the other. This kind of betrayal often builds over time and is rooted in a partner's unmet emotional needs rather than a deliberate desire to hurt or deceive. In these cases, infidelity becomes a symptom of a larger emotional void, often created by years of unresolved tension, miscommunication, or emotional absence. Couples may live under the same roof for years, share meals, raise children, pay bills together, and yet still feel oceans apart emotionally. They might speak daily, but not connect. Intimacy, once flourishing, dwindles into routine, and meaningful conversations are replaced with logistics. One person begins to fade into the background, losing their sense of individuality and emotional relevance in the relationship. When emotional needs go unmet for extended periods, people become vulnerable, often unknowingly, to emotional connection elsewhere. This vulnerability doesn't stem from weakness or moral failure. It comes from a deep human need to be emotionally understood, valued, and affirmed. In many stories of real, life emotional infidelity, the betrayal starts subtly. A conversation at work, a friendship formed at the gym, a kind stranger who offers a listening ear during a tough moment. These interactions, innocent at first, begin to feel like lifelines. Someone finally asks, "Are you okay?" Or notices something as simple as a new hair. Cut things a partner might have stopped doing years ago. The emotionally neglected individual feels warmth, relevance, and attention, which can quickly spiral into emotional dependency. These moments, while seemingly trivial, have an enormous impact because they offer what the primary relationship no longer does: recognition and emotional resonance. This type of emotional affair is often dismissed or minimized by society because it lacks the physical drama associated with traditional cheating. However, for many people who experience it, emotional infidelity cuts even deeper than a physical betrayal. It involves feelings, shared secrets, inside jokes, and a kind of intimacy that should be exclusive to a committed partnership. Emotional affairs challenge the foundation of trust because they are harder to detect and easier to deny. A partner might insist, "We're just friends," even as they hide messages, lie about time spent together, and emotionally invest in someone outside the relationship. What makes emotional infidelity even more complicated is that it's rarely about one person being the villain. Often, both partners have played a role in creating the emotional chasm. One may have grown distant, emotionally unavailable, or distracted by stress and life's demands. The other may have failed to communicate their needs, suppressed their feelings, or waited too long for change. Over time, both individuals fall into patterns that feel safe but emotionally sterile. The betrayal then feels shocking not because it came out of nowhere, but because neither person noticed how far apart they had drifted until someone else entered the picture. Emotional infidelity often happens in environments where intimacy and connection are least expected. Places like the workplace, community groups, or even during something as mundane as a house repair, as seen in many real-life narratives. This underscores the fact that emotional vulnerability can strike at any moment, and the longing to feel understood does not wait for the right circumstances. It's not about lust or temptation, it's about fulfillment. When a person who feels emotionally ignored suddenly finds someone who listens, engages, and connects, it can feel like a breath of fresh air after years of suffocation. Emotional infidelity is a reminder that relationships require constant emotional maintenance. Love alone isn't enough to sustain a deep bond. It must be nurtured with attention, presence, and ongoing emotional availability. When these elements are missing, the ground becomes fertile for emotional attachment outside the partnership. The tragedy is that these betrayals often blindside people who never thought they'd cross any lines. They weren't looking to cheat, they were looking to feel alive again. And that's what makes emotional infidelity both so common and so heartbreakingly human. A single moment of attention and emotional intimacy can unravel years of routine, often catching people completely off guard. Relationships, especially long-term ones, can gradually fall into a rhythm that becomes more about function than connection. Couples operate like business partners, organizing chores, raising children, discussing bills, managing schedules, but often neglect the deeper emotional currents that once fueled their intimacy. In this space of quiet disconnection, even the smallest gesture of empathy or interest from an outsider can feel like a tidal wave. That one moment of emotional resonance, a genuine compliment, an attentive ear, or a kind smile, can ignite something within a person who has gone emotionally unnoticed for far too long. Many people who find themselves emotionally drawn to someone outside their relationship aren't seeking it out intentionally. They're simply reacting to a void they may not have fully realized existed until someone else stepped in to fill it. A simple question like, "How are you really doing?" asked with sincere curiosity, can stop someone in their tracks. It's a question they may not have been asked in years. That moment can feel intoxicating, even if no physical line has been crossed. It creates a doorway, a crack through which emotional energy begins to seep and grow. And when that door is opened, even just slightly, it can be incredibly difficult to close again. What makes this phenomenon especially powerful is how quickly emotional momentum builds once it starts. A connection that begins innocently can evolve rapidly. The people involved may start to seek out more time together, send longer messages, or look forward to moments when they can interact. They begin to share more personal details, dreams, frustrations, memories. With each exchange, the emotional bond tightens, often without either person acknowledging what's truly happening. It becomes a form of escapism, a space where they feel validated, alive, and emotionally fed. These feelings stand in stark contrast to the stagnation or emotional emptiness they may be experiencing in their primary relationship. Emotional intimacy is an incredibly potent force. It reaches places that physical intimacy alone cannot. It reassures, reaffirms, and reminds people of their value. When someone feels deeply seen and heard by another person, it awakens emotional layers that might have been dormant for years. This awakening can be profoundly disorienting because it doesn't feel like a conscious choice. It feels like something that just happened. but in reality, it is the product of vulnerability, emotional availability, and consistent neglect or emotional starvation within the existing relationship. That's why it shocks people, because it seems to happen so suddenly, but it's actually the final spark on top of a long, burning emotional fuse. The emotional intensity that grows from these unexpected connections often rivals or exceeds the passion people expect from physical affairs. Individuals involved may find themselves obsessively thinking about the other person, feeling elated by contact and despondent in its absence. They might begin comparing their emotional experience with this new person to what they're missing in their relationship. Even without any physical interaction, the guilt can be overwhelming. People might hide messages, lie about who they're talking to, or go to great lengths to downplay the nature of the connection. The secrecy itself becomes a sign that boundaries have already been crossed, even if nothing physical has occurred. This emotional pull often becomes a tipping point for major decisions. People start reevaluating their lives, their relationships, and what they want for the future. It can prompt confrontation, soul searching, or in some cases, a full-blown collapse of the existing relationship. What's most challenging is that the emotional affair wasn't necessarily built on seduction or temptation. It was built on attention, presence, and emotional availability. And that's what makes it feel both exhilarating and tragic. The person at the center of this story isn't always trying to hurt anyone. They're just chasing a feeling they haven't had in a long time, the feeling of being emotionally alive. This kind of connection can be particularly disorienting because it blurs the lines between right and wrong. People involved often justify their actions by telling themselves that nothing physical happened or that they're just talking. But deep down, most understand that something significant is happening. They start building emotional routines around the other person, texting first thing in the morning, sharing good news before they tell their partner, turning to them in moments of stress. These behaviors slowly shift the emotional center of gravity away from the committed relationship, and that shift is both dangerous and difficult to reverse. At its core, this experience shows that emotional intimacy is not just a romantic luxury, it's a necessity. It's what fuels trust, connection, and long-term stability in relationships, and when it's missing, people become emotionally exposed in ways they never anticipated. What surprises them most isn't that they crossed a line. It's how quickly and deeply they became invested in someone else emotionally. That moment of unexpected connections, small as it may seem, can carry the weight of everything that was missing. And once it's felt, it becomes impossible to ignore.